thanks, Rob. Thank you all for coming. When I started to prepare this talk, I didn't really quite know what to do. I've been at this now almost 50 years. And the question is, what the heck can I talk about in 50 years? So if you'll indulge me a little bit, I'll talk about a little history and then talk about the work I'm doing supported by the Foundation Professorship, which is, I think, very, very exciting. So, as Rob said, early in my career, I was a pretty hardcore geologist. Running around the world, Cyprus and Iceland doing field work, and had a pretty big experimental program in crystallization kinetics. In the early 1980s, there were huge advances in nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy that allowed really high-resolution studies for solid materials. And at that point, I was fortunate enough to hook up with a group that was really at the cutting edge of doing this. And the more I talked to them, the more I was convinced that this was really an extraordinary opportunity to make some critical contributions. So, in effect, I did a second PhD. I actually took a bunch of courses, all kinds of study. I knew about NMR, but I didn't know all the details, and spent lots and lots of late nights in the lab, and that way, really got into this. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and then we'll talk about what's going on now. So just for the development officers, I want you to know I put that in purple so that we recognize the color of your operation. It's all for you guys. Okay, so most people here probably know what NMR is. It's the same basic physics as magnetic resonance imaging. And so how does all this work? Well, the instrument itself is a big magnet with a whole bunch of really fancy electronics in that box, those boxes. Fancy stuff. So that thing's taller than a person, typically. And then you take a sample, put it in these little teeny tiny sample holders, put that in this thing here, which spins it at, the experiments we do, spins it much faster than a dentistryl, and there's all kinds of fancy radio frequency electronics in that too. This then fits in the top of that. That thing goes in the magnet, and then we collect the data. So basically, what is it we're doing? We're taking a rock or a piece of glass or whatever biological sample. We're putting it in a magnet. We're making it a radio transmitter. We're detecting the signal from that radio transmitter, and it's going to tell us about the arrangement of the atoms, molecules, and the structure, and how they're moving around. And every time I think about it in those terms, I think, how amazing is that? That something like that can be done. So I love this stuff. So there were in the early 80s, there were several groups around the world working on these class of problems. And so what's the data look like? So there's some NMR spectra, and that axis there is basically frequency. And this is chemically useful because the frequency of this quantum phenomenon called spin is modified by the local chemical bonding environment, and also how the atoms and molecules are moving around. So the chemical bonding environment spreads that frequency out over some range, and that's what we get. So how the heck do you take some wiggles like that on a computer screen and make any sense out of it? I mean, it's still amazing to me. Well, it turns out that the fundamental theory of NMR is really extraordinarily well developed. And there's all there's good ways one can interpret. That doesn't matter what this is. This is just illustrative. So the theory is very highly developed, and one can extract lots of information. There's also a very large empirical database from different kinds of samples that we and others have contributed to that help with that interpretation. So we get something like that, and you'll see a bunch of them, and we make some interpretations. So we and several other groups around the world started just studying these materials, and we made quite a lot of contributions to understanding sort of basic mineral structure. And this is just, again, this is illustrative of solving a long-standing problem about the structure of mixed layered clays. But again, you can take something like that, that's the spectrum, and really extract very useful information. Okay? So we did a lot of that with just fundamental kind of aluminosilicate chemistry, I guess. We also did a lot of work on glasses. And we actually sold this to funding agencies on the basis of understanding glass structure early on. Initially, it was all aluminosilicate glasses related to geochemistry, crystallization of lava and magma, which is what we were working on at the time. But that dragged us off into studying basic glass science. Lots of issues there. Those are aluminosilicate glasses. There's some aluminum spectra. We learned a lot about their structure. We started working on a whole bunch of technologically important glasses. This is just illustrating some aluminophosphate glasses. Those things have very high thermal expansion coefficients used in glass-to-metal seals. This was actually collected using laundered Star Wars money back in the 80s. So why do we want to understand the structure of stuff like this? Well, mostly chemists in this audience, you already know. Understanding the fundamental structure of material and its relationship to the properties is really lets us provide a scientific basis for understanding those properties, but also predicting the behavior of the properties, say, as we modify composition. And that's what happened with these aluminophosphate glasses. We did a lot of work on aluminoborate glasses, Pyrex kind of stuff, mostly for nuclear waste applications, and lots of other things like that I think took us all different kinds of directions in understanding natural materials and technological materials. We also did an awful lot of work on cement chemistry. We were part of one of the initial 9 NSF Science and Technology Centers that was supporting cement chemistry, and did I think some very interesting work. We learned a lot. Cement science flies below the radar screen at Michigan State, but most of the big engineering colleges around the country will have a civil engineering materials program, and cement's at the core of it. And of course, cement industry, cement and concrete industry, is an immense industry worldwide with a huge research infrastructure all over the world. And our contribution, based on silicon NMR data that look like that, was basically the fundamental understanding of the, call it molecular scale, crystallographic, unit cell scale structure for the variation in the composition of this stuff that called CSH, which is the main binding phase for for cement and concrete. And I think that provided a basis for understanding a lot about the sort of chemical and then hierarchical behavior of this stuff. So that was really quite enjoyable set of work. Now, this is now getting to what's this, we're working on, supported by the Foundation Professorship. One of the themes that we've followed for many years is trying to understand what's happening at the interface between water and some fluid, or water and a solid, or some other fluid and a solid. We'll see more later on. Turns out this is extremely hard to study, and NMR is a very powerful tool for looking at it. So, for example, these are cesium-133 NMR spectra for a clay, and there's room temperature. And you look at the spectrum, and it's pretty boring. Not much going on. This is one peak. Okay. It turns out that if you go down to low temperature, you resolve two peaks. This one, oh, yeah, okay. This, well, two peaks. So we're going to see a lot of figures like this. This crosshatch kind of stuff is the solid. It's the clay. There's clay there. And here we have a pore in that clay filled, in this case, with water and cesium. And this turns out to be a nuclear waste issue. Cesium-137 is one of the major components of the US nuclear waste inventory, and a really high energy gamma emitter. It's bad stuff. So we wanted to understand what the cesium's doing. And it turns out what this is telling us is, in fact, that the cesium's near the surface in two different kinds of environments. One is surrounded by water molecules, but close to the surface. And the other is actually directly coordinated to the atoms of the surface with some water molecules around it, called inner sphere and outer sphere. As you raise the temperature, what happens is those two peaks merge together, and that represents cesium hopping between those two environments. And it turns out at that temperature, about -50, we can tell that the frequency of that hopping is about 10,000 times a second. And you can model it in more detail than that. But here's the point. You get structure and dynamics from this kind of spectra. Okay, why do we care about this? Well, there's all kinds of process chemistry that goes on at fluid-solid interfaces, but from a geochemical standpoint, surface interactions between the solid surfaces and the fluid exert huge control over all kinds of things going on in the environment. So, surface interactions control behavior of water, all kinds of natural and synthetic dissolved materials, natural organic matter, we'll talk a little bit about that, and of course pollutants for all types. So that's just a soil profile showing that. So we're interested because of sort of near surface environmental issues. It's also really important deeper in the earth. There's a oil rig and an oil well down there. The rocks deep in the earth where they're producing oil or trying to do carbon sequestration are porous. And again, the interaction of the fluid in those pores and the rock really controls a lot of things. So you know, it's a relevant situation. Oil and gas reservoirs, CO2 floods, hydrofracking, whether you like it or not, geologic sequestration. So it turns out now our approach is to use combined experiment and calculation. And I want to talk a little bit about how these, the core of the talk here, how calculations work with the NMR to resolve some of these issues, and really where we're taking that with support from the Foundation Professorship. Okay, ignore those equations. The computational methods we use are mostly molecular dynamics type calculations, very different than I think what Andrew's going to talk about in a bit. But we use it because we want to understand the complex cooperative behavior between the surface, the fluid, dissolved species. We want to understand it through time, both structure and dynamics. So we use this molecular dynamics method. People go to war over the details of all this, but fundamentally it's pretty easy. You have a computer, and in that computer you build a box. You put a bunch of atoms and molecules in the box. You give those atoms and molecules some properties, charge, and that kind of stuff. Shake it up and let it go, and provide you all kinds of information about structure and dynamics. And I want to introduce Naresh Loganathan. Naresh, raise your hand. He's the guy in our group who's really responsible for most of this. And one of the things that the Foundation Professorship does is support Naresh. So it's really critical to this whole research program. So we do computational modeling. As Rob alluded to, we do most of our NMR at the Pacific Northwest National Lab, a place called the Environmental Molecular Sciences Lab, which has a truly amazing NMR facility. It's a national user facility. You write proposals to get time like you would for a telescope. We've been very successful. The important thing is they have a really unique setup there for doing this so-called magic angle spinning NMR at elevated pressures and temperatures. And as far as I know, there's no place else in the world that does this. And 400 bars 20C or 225 bars and 250C. And for my chemist colleagues, if you have interest in understanding reactions involving solids under those kinds of conditions, come talk to me. Because the PNNL people are really pushing this to understand all kinds of chemical processes, and it really is very, very powerful. So I'm going to talk about modeling. I'm going to talk about high temperature mass NMR. Okay, so as an example, we're interested in what carbon dioxide is doing if you pump it down into the earth and how it interacts with the minerals. So we collected carbon NMR spectra of CO2 in the nanopore galleries between two layers of clay. And there's the scale, 4 angstroms there. And the spectrums, this is a terrible figure, but the spectrum's in blue, and everything else is in theoretical spectra. What we concluded is, in fact, that the only way you can get that spectrum is if these CO2 molecules are sitting in there kind of parallel to the clay layers and rotating rapidly around an axis perpendicular to their molecular axis. For the chemist, reorients the chemical shift anisotropy tensor. Okay, but we couldn't tell that from the molecule doing the same thing, this librational motion, but also wobbling back and forth. Just, don't have the spectral resolution. So Naresh did some MD calculations for that kind of situation. And here he's plotting the angle between the clay and the CO2 molecule from these calculations. And sure enough, the average position of that CO2 is parallel to the clay. But what he's showing, in fact, is that it is doing this kind of wobbling motion, and that the wobbling is, ± plus or minus 20 degrees or so. You'd never be able to learn that from just the experimental data. And yeah, and so this really provides a hard basis for understanding what CO2 is doing in these clays. Oops, yeah. Okay, another example. This is carbon NMR spectra of CO2 and methane in a compressed clay sample, artificial shale we're calling it. I want to focus on the methane region here. You just put methane. Methane goes into the inner layers too. I never believed it would do it. It does. And we see two resonances. This one here is methane, that's natural gas, in those inner layer galleries of the clay. And then this peak here, that the breadth represents methane that's exchanging between those inner layer galleries, and I said macropores is really the bulk space in the rotor. Okay, so if you're going to pump CO2 down into the earth, there's methane around, what's the CO2 going to do to the methane? Well, we did that experiment at high temperatures and pressures. And what happens is the methane peak changes its position, becomes a lot smaller. Methane's being replaced. And this peak over here that represents methane exchanging becomes narrower. Much less methane exchange going on. So what do we say is that CO2 forces methane out of the small pores into the larger pores and decreases the rate that the methane's exchanging between those two environments. Okay, another example of that, this is now for hardcore NMR people. This is a 2D so-called exchange spectrum for methane in this little bit different sample system. There's methane in these little teeny tiny pores. There's methane in a middle-sized pore, and there it is in macropore. But with this exchange spectrum, you get these so-called cross peaks that demonstrate that the methane is exchanging between those environments. If you get a cross peak, the methane's jumping back and forth between those environments. And I didn't show all the data, but you do it as a function of so-called contact time. And you can get an idea of the characteristic time, the characteristic frequency for that exchange. And it turns out that for this sample, it's of the order of 1/4 of a second, which is a pretty long time for a chemical process. But I don't know any other method that would give you that kind of information. This is really quite extraordinary. Okay, so how do we do these calculations? So this is a relatively new method that we use, a molecular dynamics method. We call it constant reservoir composition. This was cooked up by a guy named Oscar Yazadin and Michel Parnello in Switzerland. Oscar's a professor at University College London, but he's also a adjunct professor here working with us. And another thing the foundation support provides is money to fly him here every once in a while and really work with us on advanced techniques like this. So this particular method, there's a clay sample, call it that. Could be anything. Could be a membrane or whatever you want. This is very general. But in this case, we have a clay sample, clay, and a pore that we vary the width of. And in this technique, what you can do is you can control the composition there and there in a way that's not possible with other mechanisms, with other computational procedures. So you can get, in our case, we looked at the steady state partitioning of CO2 and methane, but you can also look at the steady state diffusive and pressure gradient driven transport rates. So this is really a very powerful tool. And again, without foundation support, we wouldn't be working on this. So Naresh did these calculations, and what did he find? Well, absolutely, the CO, just connecting back to what we said about that. The CO2 is absolutely preferred in small pores relative to the methane. So pumping CO2 into the ground in say a carbon sequestration situation will release the methane and definitely drive it from small pores, rocks are heterogeneous stuff, small pores into the larger pores. And one thing that might happen is that would make the natural gas more readily recoverable. And the PNNL guys are pushing that. So once again, these calculations really support, they really help interpret the NMR results that says, yes, CO2 does drive methane into larger pores. And we also talked about exchange rates. So the calculations to understand the effect of CO2 and methane in these pores on the diffusion coefficients in those pores, we're getting going on that. So that's, again, something supported by the foundation. Okay, so just a couple other set of themes that our group's working on, again, supported by the foundation. We're very interested in the interaction of mineral surfaces and natural organic matter and other organic pollutants in the environment. And here's just a snapshot from an MD simulation. There's a surface there. There's a whole cluster of NOM molecules, natural organic molecules. And the MD simulations are showing, in fact, is that these things stick to the surface through cation bridges. The calcium especially will coordinate to the surface and also coordinate to the carboxylic groups of the NOM, stick it to the surface. And we're in the middle of writing a really long paper connecting MD simulations and a bunch of experimental work talking about that. So these mineral-organic interactions are a main theme. We're also very interested in reactivity, and these high-pressure NMR capabilities let us study in situ reactions. And I don't want to go through all that, but this paper on a reaction of clays with water-saturated CO2 solutions just got published. So those are the themes. Mineral surface interactions, including organic stuff, transport, structure dynamics in multi-scale porous materials, and reaction processes especially in CO2-rich environments. Finally, the last thing that this foundation supports for is that let me put together a symposium for next spring's ACS, 40 years of high-resolution NMR spectroscopy of inorganic solids. And we just got all the abstracts in, and we're probably going to have 2 days worth of talks looking at sort of a bit of the history of all of this, and also looking forward to where NMR is going to be useful in understanding inorganic systems going forward. And again, we wouldn't have been able to do that without the foundation professorship. So thank you.